In 2013, the Philadelphia 76ers decided it was time to go from a team trying to contend to a full-blown rebuild in what they'd quickly referred to as the process, which consisted of a ton of tanking, a ton of very high draft picks, a ton of losses, and even more painful games to watch. It was Philly GM Sam Hinkie's master plan, and this process had so many ups and so many downs. A lot of ups where fans completely bought in, and a lot of downs where the 76ers were unanimously the laughingstock of the NBA. The team has come a very long way since then though, but the overall process, at least in my mind, has been a failure, and I'll explain why. But first off, like I mentioned, it started in 2013 when they made the questionable decision to trade their 22-year-old first-time All-Star in Jrue Holiday during that year's draft for Nerlens Noel. That was followed up by waiving or letting every veteran and notable player on the team walk, and so the process begun. And it lasted all the way until 2017, and throughout that time they would fill most of their roster with second-round picks, G League players, or guys on minimum deals so they could lose as many games possible. At one point losing 26 games in a row in a single season, and over the 4-year span they finished with a 19-63 record, 18-64, an all-time worst 10-72, and a 28-54 record. So this was basically the process, tanking for picks and making trades to try and land players. It made them the worst NBA team for years. And just imagine being a Philly fan at this time. That's 4 to 5 entire years of pain that you would have had to go through. But okay, with all their terrible seasons established, this is where we can get into players that they drafted. Now, if you're going to be that bad for that long, you're going to want something in return. Well, throughout their 5-year plan, they really couldn't have asked for much more. Their top picks included in 2013 the 6th and 11th overall picks, in 2014 the 3rd and 10th, 2015 the 3rd, 2016 the 1st, 24th and 26th, and the 2017 first overall pick. They had the opportunity to do some great things, but I don't know that I'd say they did, because they used them to pick Nerlens Noel and Michael Carter Williams, Joel Embiid and Dario Saric, Jahlil Okafor, Ben Simmons, Timothy Luwawu-Cabarrot, and Furkan Korkmaz, and then Markelle Fultz. And let's start with 2013. Nerlens Noel was supposed to go first overall, but since he was injured, he went 6th, and Philly didn't mind trading to get him because they had time to spare and let him recover from his injury. But even if they did, they should have been able to see that he didn't have a very bright future, so that was a flop. They did get Michael Carter Williams 11th though, who quickly proved himself and became Rookie of the Year in a move no one really saw coming, and I will give it to him here. They knew that Williams was overperforming on their bad team, and he actually wasn't that great of a player, so they traded him when his value was at the highest and got a future first in return. Overall though, not a good year for drafting, but it's okay because 2014 came around and they drafted an injured Joel Embiid and Dario Saric at 11. Now at the time this wasn't ideal because Embiid was injured and Saric was still playing overseas, meaning both men didn't even really play a game for the 76ers until 2 years later in 2016. But like I said before, Philly didn't want to be competitive, so they had all the time in the world for these guys to sit out. I will give it to them though, they signed undrafted Robert Covington in 2014 too, and would later use him and Saric as the two main pieces to trade for Jimmy Butler. So I'd say 2014 was a success in terms of their future. In 2015 though, things get weird because they draft Jahlil Okafor, their 3rd center in 3 years, meaning they now have him, Noel, and Embiid all on the same roster, and I guess they were going for the approach of just drafting the best player available, but seeing how Jahlil turned out, they couldn't even do that, and this was a terrible year in the draft for them. 2016 at the time was a great one though, because they drafted Ben Simmons 1st overall, who was supposed to be in some people's mind the next LeBron James, and I can't take any credit away from Philly here. It's nothing against them, but seeing how things have turned out, this was once again a bad draft. But they couldn't have known Ben wasn't going to shoot, and they couldn't have known he was going to force a trade 5 years later, and one they'll probably get nothing much back in return. So honestly, they had the 1st overall pick, but still a bad draft. And same thing for 2017. They had the 1st overall pick again for the 2nd year in a row, but this one I wouldn't say it was at all their fault, because they drafted Markelle Fultz, and they should have. He was pretty unanimously the 1st overall pick that year, and no one could have saw it coming when he forgot how to shoot the ball and has been a huge bust ever since. Himself and his shot never recovered, and it was tough for Philly because they had drafted themselves a big 3, but it didn't ever turn out to be a thing. Now I get hindsight's 2020, but just for fun here, let's see what the best case scenario would have been for them with all those draft picks. Again, I get it's not realistic, but let's just see. In 2013, they were always going to get Noel because they traded for him. Well, Giannis wasn't picked till 15th, so they could have drafted him instead of MCW. In 2014, Joel Embiid was the right pick at 3rd, but with the 10th pick, they could have drafted Zach LaVine instead. In 2015, they got Jahlil Okafor, but could have actually taken Devin Booker. 2016, I don't fault them for, but in 2017, they traded up to get Markelle Fultz, but if they would have stayed put, they could have just drafted Jason Tatum and kept their future first. So originally, Unfortunately, this is what they ended up with, and this is what they could have potentially had. Again, it's not realistic, but it is kind of sad they didn't get at least one of these guys. And it does make you realize kind of just how bad the 76ers did in the draft throughout that span of time. It's almost as if they're pretty close to having the worst case scenario given their situation. 2 first overall picks that are going to turn into next to nothing, 2 highly drafted centers who did the same, and I've carefully avoided talking about Joel's injury history, but now's a good time. Listen, after Ben Simmons gets traded, unless something crazy happens, Joel Embiid may be the only at least all-star left on the team. And to have gone through the entire process and only a few years later only have Joel left is a shame. Don't get me wrong, he's an MVP caliber player now, one of the best in the league, and had he not gotten injured this year, he could have won it. But that's the problem. He got injured this year, again. The most games he's ever played in a season was 64, and in his 7 seasons since being drafted, he's played 0 games, 31, 63, 64, 51, and 51 games, which is 260 in total, equaling to about 3 full seasons in the league. He's played around 7 of them, but has only played in 3 full ones. So there's definitely a problem, and this past year was the perfect example with how he tore his meniscus in the first round of the playoffs. He missed about 20 regular season games, but then still got injured right when the playoffs began. Now all of this is to say that it's not a good look for Philly to have your superstar max contract player be this injury prone and unreliable. I don't think they'll ever win a championship because it's just too up in the air on if Joel will stay healthy, and based on his past, since he hasn't made it through a single season healthy yet, chances are he won't. And going into every year and every playoff series, having to hope that the one star you'll have left from 5 years of pain and suffering won't get injured, in my mind, really means the process was a failure. And while we're at it, let's not forget to mention that they had many opportunities to trade Ben Simmons, but the fact that they finally tried to trade him for James Harden, failed, and didn't find a trade for him afterwards was another huge mistake. I'm not mad they offered him for James. I think it was a great move and it's what they should have done. It was one the Rockets could have easily accepted had they not been offered an insane amount of draft compensation in the Brooklyn deal. Houston just picked draft picks over a cornerstone young player, and that's fine. But my problem is the fact that Philly made the offer for Harden, Ben Simmons was told that he should expect to be traded, the trade fell through, and Philly just carried on like nothing happened, and let it get to the point that it's at today. Of course Simmons' loyalty was going to be gone. If you try to trade your star and the deal falls through, you better find another trade for him quick, because once you go to trade a player and the news gets out, there's no going back and they're probably going to get offended. And besides, even back then it was time for them to trade him anyways, so the fact that they held on to him and were just going to move on was insane. Now don't get me wrong, Ben deserves a lot of blame here too. He's been completely wrong about how he's handled things, saying he's going to sit out games and not participate with the team. It's caused him to lose a lot of people's respect, but you really can't be surprised this happened. So, because it's a lot of management's fault too. Honestly though, I do love the team that they've managed to put together around Joel, and I have for a few years, but it's just not enough. And this is by no means a hate video for Philly. I want them to succeed, and I hope Joel stays healthy and they do win a title. Their best bet for the future is to get at least a near star like CJ McCollum in return for Ben Simmons when they're eventually forced to trade him, so they can make their real run at winning it all. I think CJ would be a perfect fit. You'd fix the spacing problem this team's had, would be able to shift Seth Curry back to point guard, and have McCollum play his natural position. It's just that for them to win a title or even be a real threat in the Eastern Conference, there's just way too many things that would have to go right, and I can't see it happening. They'd have to trade Ben Simmons for good value, Tobias Harris would have to finally step up his game a little bit more, and Joel would have to stay healthy. Don't get me wrong, for the process to have had to work, it doesn't mean Philly would have needed a championship. The fact that they made it to where they have these past few years is a success on its own, but just on how things played out and where they could have been had they played things right is why I'd call the whole thing a failure.